Right. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for the presentation. My name is David Norton. I'm a student at GPS here in the Mass IA program. I'm also a major in the U.S. Army, a foreign area officer for Northeast Asia. So I'm wondering, you highlighted very well how cyber capabilities are more suited towards deception and they're necessarily secretive. So then how do you go about studying this? We talked a lot about the importance of means, but do we necessarily even know what the means are if they're kept secret? So I'm just wondering about the implications for sort of this new era of secrecy for what you gentlemen do. Again, how do you study something that you can't see and that's kept hidden? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very salient issue that I think many people operating in this subject matter are struggling with. Another hat I wear is trying to make it an area in which academic political science can function by the standards that it has come to appreciate, which is we want to test our theories and demonstrate that they're not just speculations about the world, but that they actually have some empirical validity. If we can't collect data in this data-intensive space, then we've got a problem. Two reactions. One is that when you can't see something that you care about, you look for an analog, and a lot of that's going on. There's also a complementarity and substitutability between theory and evidence. It has to be the case that whatever is true, at least my bias is that the truth is logical, right? That doesn't mean that all logics are true. It means that all illogics are wrong. And a useful way to sort of pare down what we can think about in this space is to look at what people say with a somewhat jaded eye and ask yourself, does this really make sense in terms of what we understand about the nature of the processes generically that we're dealing with? Cyberspace will not be a conflict space that has nothing to do and no relationship to any other conflict space, because it's still, as a conflict space, about conflict, right? Finally, I'd say that I think places like Fort Meade, this is where Cybercom is located, they have to juggle, they have to balance some factors. And there may be an argument for being a little bit less restrictive. Our society throughout time has chosen a more open approach to a lot of issues, including oftentimes security issues, not always. And there's a limit to this. But one argument that I think we could sustain, and I've talked to others about this, people like Canberra Warren at the Naval Postgraduate School feel very strongly about this. We could actually potentially do better in some respects by opening that cordon a little bit and including more of a conversation than being very, very restrictive about it. Because it's a fragile environment that's subject to revelation, there's this temptation to put it under heavy classification. But I think, once time has passed, anything that's 5 or 10 years old is not operational anyway, and maybe maybe that's an area for conversation with folks in that field.
Yeah, I wonder if I can take that. It's a fantastic question. When I said that the cyber age is about the increase in the capacity for deception, I didn't say successful deception. I said attempts at deception, right? So we have more evidence of it because we have lots and lots of evidence of things that have gone wrong. In fact, they go wrong all the time, right? The fact that the barriers to entry are lower means that you have lots of people that are trying lots of things. They don't always have the skills to do it. And it's hard to do it, right? Even the best in the business, right? The NSA, the Israeli Unit 8200, right, with Stuxnet, they still made some basic mistakes. Stuxnet, when it got into the door, right, and it landed on a computer, it looked around and said, what are you defended by? Are you defended by ESET? Are you defended by McAfee? Are you defended by Norton Antivirus? If so, I'm going to go left or right or do a backflip, right? But it didn't ask, are you defended by a Belarusian antivirus? Right? Because that's what the Iranians who are under sanctions were actually running. Okay? So Stuxnet got into a conflict with this particular antivirus and got itself stuck in a reboot loop, and that's what started the initial investigation, which led to the worldwide disclosure of this incredibly sophisticated piece of code. So that's one thing, right? We have mistakes that are made, and when mistakes are made, they're often made in a very public way, right? The NSA is very, very good at staying hidden. But when you see its tools, you go, this can't be anyone other than the NSA. Okay? When Kaspersky revealed this suite of tools called Equation, which then showed up in the Shadow Broker suite as well, which was kind of dumped from an NSA employee, there was stuff in there that just wowed security researchers. It had the ability to persist on a hard disk beyond military-grade erasure procedures. Okay? Nobody thought that was possible. NSA figured that out. Well, now that you see that, you're like, well, there's probably only 2 actors that are in the world that could figure this out. We're an ally with one of them, so we know who that's about. Plus, it's only infecting computers in the Middle East and Russia and China. Okay? So the attribution net starts to narrow pretty quickly. The second piece of the widening arc of deception is that more non-traditional actors are involved in it. Okay? So Fortune 500 firms have their own counterintelligence organizations, right? Individual citizens and human rights groups, right, that are getting hammered by authoritarian governments, not only in their own countries, but when they're abroad, right? So the Chinese have interest in hitting China hands in DC or penetrating Western media, right? So you have the opportunity to observe these things. And it also means that the civilian cybersecurity firms have instruments with a much wider aperture in many cases than even the National Security Agency, right, or GCHQ, because they're looking at states. They've got military networks, they've got military capabilities, but when you load Kaspersky or ESET onto your system, right, you're participating in this voluntary botnet of millions of machines, right? So they're just seeing a lot more stuff that nobody else sees. So I think that's the answer to that question. And the third piece of that is, while cyber is not useful for deterrence, it doesn't stop people from trying, right? In deterrence theory, there's this distinction between general deterrence, which is keeping people from challenging you in the first place, and immediate deterrence, which is once somebody's made a challenge, getting them to back down. Okay? There's reason to believe that cyber may actually be a little bit useful for general deterrence. Okay? The more Snowdens we have, and shadow broker events, and Stuxnets, right? The more you get to see, hey, the NSA is pretty good at what it does. And while some of those exploits may be burned, it looks like they have some really smart people there that can probably come up with more. So if I'm thinking of penetrating a high-grade military system, I'm probably going to be a little reticent, right? Because I think I might be detected by the expertise that's in place. Okay, so I think there are some important caveats on this.
And an inability to deter is not the same as a failure to generate deterrence. And I think this is where the cross-domain logic really comes in. Precisely because it's hard to guarantee the protection of your electronic command control, communications, computing systems. That makes it disproportionately difficult to plan and organize and execute a good attack, a large attack against an adversary. And that has the paradoxical effect, potentially, of discouraging aggression in world affairs. If you're not confident that your electronic systems are secure, that's going to make you more reticent to act in the physical domains that we're more used to. And despite the fact that we could potentially call cyberspace an offense-dominant space, it may have the converse effect in other domains of making them more defense-dominant and more risk-averse.
Jesse Driscoll, GPS. So you guys, you just talked about offense-defense advantage, Erik. My question is about offense-defense distinguishability, which is the other part of the Jervis 78. If you guys could unravel for me the difference between the way you see information operations and the way you see cultural production and soft power production generally, I think that would actually be helpful, because I haven't read your book, but I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So really anything you have to say is interesting.
I'm not sure if I have too much intelligence to say about this, but I think I could slice it in a slightly different way that might be provocative or interesting. Jon and I were just talking about a separate piece of this, which is sort of taking apart deterrence theory. And we got a little flavor of that in the presentation, but we didn't go into much detail. Generally speaking, people think, especially in the security business, think they understand deterrence pretty well. It's one of those that, you know, we closed the book on it 25 years ago and nobody's written. I remember meeting Tom Schelling and he said nothing interesting in deterrence has been done since 1966. He picked that date with a purpose because that was the last time he had written anything important on deterrence, right? But I think there's something fundamentally missing because two things that everybody seems to agree about deterrence. One is it's about avoiding contests, like avoiding wars and stuff. And the other is it's about contesting space in some way, about the status quo, let's say. Those two things are fundamentally in tension. You want to avoid a war? Give somebody what they want, and the odds that they're going to attack you probably don't go up, right? But then you don't have what you want. So there's a trade-off between these two. Whether it's through military or non-military means, there's two things always going on in any civilization that is in a contested relationship with somebody else. One is you're trying to build up your capacity to impose your will on the other side, and the other is you're trying to avoid having to use it, because if you don't have to use it and you get your way anyway, that's really cool. And that's the sort of you know, gumdrop candy outcome of deterrence that we all like, which is how we won the war without really trying, right? Without actually fighting anyone. And that's a wonderful thing if you can pull it off. But I think, generally speaking, you have to make hard choices about whether, for example, you're going to get more social cohesion if you ask for a more intractable demand, which then makes it more likely that you're going to have to fight to keep it, right? Many societies, leaders lose their jobs for agreeing to compromise with an adversary. But if they don't agree to compromise, then they're not in the kind of deterrence mode that we were talking about with candy and gumdrops. They're either going to have to double down on their ability to protect the society by spending more on defense and recruiting more young men and women to the army, or they're going to have to face a higher risk of war. One of the examples we use in some of our work, the U.S. in the 1950s and 60s made a risky choice, but a choice that was politically acceptable in the United States. Instead of putting a force in Europe that would be able to defend Europe, they put a small force in Europe and they relied on nuclear weapons. We were the only country that had an avowed policy of first use of nuclear weapons. It wasn't because we were more evil than the other nuclear powers. It was because we were less willing as a society to pay the high price that deterrence through conventional forces required. And we were willing to take a higher risk of deterrence failure and a terrible outcome in return for paying less for the outcome we hope for. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just to jump on the information operations question, I guess my first instinct is to think about this in terms of that, you know, stability and stability question, right? Cyberspace is lots of layers, right? So you've got physical infrastructure, and then you've got logical protocols that allow networks to connect to each other, and then software applications sit on top of there, and then there's organizational protocols about how you use that software, and then there's the content that's on those shared networks, okay? And a lot of the cyber war discussion is all about how do you break things down at the lower level? How do you break infrastructure? How do you steal stuff by subverting protocol or subverting the application? But I think what you're getting at is, let's assume all of that works really, really well, right? You still got this layer up at the top, right, that can be very, very frothy and contested and potentially consequential, okay? And, you know, I think that's what 2016 really dramatized, where, you know, yeah, the Russians did some hacking, but what they did was use the internet exactly as it was intended, right? The internet reduces transaction costs for economic and social exchange, and the Russians participated in that same shared network, and they did something we didn't like, right? But they didn't break anything. And so how you think about that becomes really, really hard. Now, was that offense dominant, right, in a system that was designed to be open and shared and transparent? By participating in that very thing, you now create something that you don't like. I think this is why we're kind of tying ourselves in knots, because we clearly don't like this, and yet it's predicated on a lot of other things not happening. Okay, so kind of the classic Churchillian jaw is better than war, right? A lot of the war goes away, and the jaw is now happening on this global scale, and we just don't like what people are saying. Well, okay, so I guess we have to find ways to say different things or evaluate what's being said and compete in that space. So I think there are these subtleties when we think about offensive advantage that are not really about offensive advantage in the traditional military sense, that are more about, this is why I was stressing deception, using these protocols that are designed for open social exchange, but with an additional degree of freedom that makes it slightly different than what you intended.
And Russia's kind of playing, not completely, but mostly playing the game the way we want them to, in effect. We don't want them to play this, right? But much like during the Cold War, where both sides decided that open confrontation was too risky and costly, so what they did is they went underground and did covert operations and fought through proxies and so on. They were nasty to each other. This is stability and instability. They were nasty to each other in a furtive way. And guess what? We've got a new domain in which you can be nasty to each other in a furtive way, and that's what's happening.
Hi, Eric and Jon. Thanks for the talk. I think it's an issue that strategists are very interested in right now. I'm Kevin Brazilian in the Political Science Department, PhD. I'm also a U.S. Air Force officer. My question's kind of trying to link together two areas, and one is this idea that with more domains, the question of deterrence seems like it's grown to just an idea of deterrence to a deterrence from what? And you touched on that. Do we think that deterrence from funding proxies or deterrence from information operations is the goal, or is deterrence still just from conventional war? And then tying in that is this idea of international norms and how that kind of fits into the picture. Can we credibly commit to cross-domain deterrence, to using conventional capabilities to protect against a cyber attack, when international norms kind of dictate that we need to treat direct action that might actually lead to deaths directly versus this indirect action where blowing up a satellite or doing a cyber attack might have really bad downstream effects, but it doesn't kill anybody directly. And so does the challenge of treating these things differently impact our credibility of deterring across domains? That's a great question.
So in a previous life, I was a combat engineer, and one of the things they taught us is you don't stop the enemy, you channelize them. And what that means is, in the old days, what we thought deterrence was you built a barrier, and the enemy sort of came up to that barrier. We even had stories about whether it was a fuzzy barrier or a clear delineated red line barrier, but basically the enemy came up to that barrier and they stopped because they couldn't go anymore. Well, that's not what military affairs looks like in the 20th or the 21st century. A more plausible scenario, I think a better descriptor, is what we get to do is decide how an adversary will confront us, not whether. So what we can do with deterrence is say, you cannot confront us here in this way, but then we're inviting them to confront us in another place, in another way. And the current gray zone operations that Russian and Chinese forces are doing is, as Jon and I have written, is basically a poster child advertising the success of the U.S. deterrent strategy in the post-Cold War world. But because deterrence isn't about stopping an adversary, it's about channelizing them, they've gone to do to confront the U.S. in other ways. It's more furtive, it's less direct, and arguably it's going to be less successful overall. But you don't get to choose an adversary that throws up their hands and says, we're not going to try. So part of this is asking the question each time, where do we want to confront our counterpart, if you're a military strategist, not whether we're going to have to. And it's possible in some settings, the example that comes to mind is basically the historians tell us that the Anglos won the Anglo-German naval arms race. And because they won the Anglo-German naval arms race, the Germans basically went into the Second World War knowing that they didn't have a navy that could confront, a surface navy that could confront the British surface navy. And they tried a little bit, but basically pretty quickly they give up and they go asymmetric. They use submarines against big surface platforms because the submarines have certain advantages in that regard. And the reason that the Germans invested heavily in the Navy, in submarines, even though the British pioneered their deployment, was that the British had an obvious advantage in surface platforms. So again and again, you'll see that what you can do is decide how your enemy will confront you. And if you think ahead a little bit, you might be able to decide where it's most attractive for you to have to confront them, as opposed to maybe confronting them in a way that's less good for you. Maybe submarines wasn't the place that the British Royal Navy wanted the Germans to confront them ultimately, and maybe having them think they were the second best surface navy in the world would have played out okay. That's a complete speculation, but. Yes, John's dad.
All right. Testing?
Yeah, all right.
Lowell Lindsay, UCLA, Political Science, 1963.
Wow.
And promptly over to Vietnam. My question is the example of Crimea, and we're talking about the certainly the post-Soviet times, post-Cold War times. If deterrence, is there any kind of learning here, an example of deterrence going on, or is it so just old classic stuff that this high level of analysis just doesn't apply? It seems to me from 1989 up until a couple, 3 years ago, that something was preventing Russia from coming in and doing what looked like a pretty logical thing for them to do, is to take over that chunk of land that gives them a very strong strategic advantage in the Mediterranean. What kept them? Why did they wait so long? What deterred them that eventually, and I assume on NATO's part, that eventually deteriorated
Well, they had
there they are, and they're probably going to stay.
They had de facto control of Crimea, and I think until 2013, they had aspirations to heavy political influence in Kiev. I like to say that, a forcing function is when you know you're going to lose if you don't act now. And their problem was they backed a guy that was more corrupt than most of the corrupt people that they've backed in the past. Yanukovych was such a scoundrel that even the pro-Russians had to end up acknowledging that he had crossed the line. Not publicly, but in practice. And so the Russians are confronted with a period of a decade or more where they're going to have no influence in Kiev. And they're moving from a world in which they can have some of everything. So in effect, the West and the East takes turns owning Ukraine and having influence over Ukraine. But after 2013, the Russians aren't going to have any say in Ukrainian politics to speak of anymore, at least for some substantial time. So they're going to own all of something, and they grab what they need, and they meddle in what they'd like. There's no need to contest something that you think you'll get in the fullness of time. There is a need to contest something when it becomes apparent that you won't. The American Civil War is basically a story about the frontier. Both sides, North and South, think they're going to prevail eventually, but at some point the South realizes that demographics and geography are against them, and that if they wait, they're going to be weaker than if they act now. It's sort of a different kind of commitment problem. So.
Hi, I'm Tom Scher. I'm with the Center for Peace and Security Studies. Full disclosure, one of those authors is my boss. So I want to ask a question. I really enjoyed this presentation. It was very useful for thinking about a lot of these things. One of the things I find especially interesting is the use of cybersecurity and other means to shape the resolve and preferences of another country. And I take part of this as maybe some domains that we traditionally think of as military or as non-military may be more military than we thought. But I wanted to open up, I know you looked at a lot of traditionally non-military domains within this lens of cybersecurity and complexity, and wanted to ask if there are some high-level findings or things that you came across in this process that you found especially interesting as kind of a teaser for us.
Real quickly.
I'm going to do a real fast one, and then I'm going to let it. This reminds me of something that I'm sort of uneasy with, and I think it sort of crystallized something for me. We've gotten in the habit in the security studies community of talking about the militarization of stuff. I think what we really mean is that these are political spaces, and that war is politics. That we're not really talking about how these things are militarized, we're talking about how they're politicized. And that we're cheapening, in some sense, the word militarized when we pretend that actions in cyberspace are military actions. We're not blowing stuff up, we're not killing people, but we are definitely playing a game of politics, not unlike the kinds of politics that you have in a domestic setting, which can sometimes be very knock down, drag out, and dirty, but normally you don't kill the other guy, you just steal votes or bribe people or the usual pleasant things that people do in politics. So, yeah, John.
So one chapter in the book that is really interesting for this question is Kelly Greenhill's chapter, where we asked her to look at non-military operations, and she looked specifically at what she calls coercively engineered migrations. Okay, so this is a situation in which a state is militarily weak, right? But it has the ability to start sending refugees, right? Intentionally, unintentionally. It can claim them, it cannot claim them, right? So this is Cuba, this is Haiti, this is the Dominican Republic. Haiti's done this several times, with the United States. And the idea is by sending these flows of refugees to a liberal democracy, which is supposed to be open and accepting of them, right? It starts to either swamp their ability to receive them. It starts to create all kinds of internal political discontent about migration, right? And so it's actually a coercive lever that the weak have against the strong. Now, so she has this database of 85 coercively engineered migrations in the 20th century that she's looked at, and she coded whether they're for deterrence or compellence. And there's this conventional wisdom in the strategic studies community that deterrence is possible, but compellence, right, forcing somebody to do something rather than threatening consequences to preserve the status quo, right? Saying, give me your wallet or I'll shoot, right? That's compellence, as opposed to don't come any closer or I shoot. That's deterrence, right? There's a sense that compellence is harder. And compellence is harder because you're trying to get somebody to do something that they're not doing. You're putting them in the domain of losses. You're having to take extra effort. You're having to reassure them that you'll stop and you won't kill another hostage if they don't give you the money, whatever, right? And she found that, when you look at coercively engineered migration, its success rate is twice that of air power. And so maybe this conventional wisdom that we have is not just a fact about strategy, it might be a fact about military coercion, right? Not a fact about coercion itself. And that there's something about the political dynamics of, migration. And she has several different kind of characteristics that differ it from military capability that make it really, really attractive for coercion generally and compellence in particular. Turns out that it's actually less useful for deterrence, but for coercion it's fantastic. Another interesting chapter in the book is by Josh Rovner, right? And cross-domain deterrence, space, cyber, China, autonomous robotics, hypersonic weapons, quantum computing, right? It's all about the frontier of the future. He looks at cross-domain deterrence in the Peloponnesian War. okay? The domain of hoplites versus triremes, okay? And he finds that, Sparta is trying to convince Athens that its, formidable ground forces make war undesirable, right? And Athens is trying to do the same thing with its navy, but because they both understand that they have weaknesses in this area, they start recruiting allies, and it introduces confusion about the cross-domain balance, okay? So cross-domain deterrence fails at the beginning of the war, right? And the war starts. Once the war starts, neither side is willing to engage the other in its favored domain, right? Athens keeps trying to get Sparta to engage at sea, and Sparta keeps trying to tempt Athens on land, right? And nothing really happens for a decade and a half, okay? Because cross-domain deterrence within war is keeping the other sides out. So, I think that piece does a really nice job in highlighting that it's the strategic characteristics of these domains rather than the technology itself that's doing the work.
We're more or less out of time, so if we could thank Professors Lindsay and Gartzke for their time and everything.
All right.